Hello, everyone, and welcome to the talk Breaking Bad, Challenging the Heteronormative Environment in the UK Police and Prisons, which is facilitated through the Gendered Organisational Practice Research Cluster at the Open University, GOP for short. My name is Nella Smolovic-Jones. I am Director of GOP, and I will be your host today. For those of you unfamiliar with this research cluster, I should say that GOP provides a space in which all those dedicated to gender equality can share insights from academic study and practice. Now, before I introduce our amazing speakers, some very light housekeeping. On your right-hand side, you will see the Q&A pane, and this is where you can type in your questions. And may I ask you please to add either letter S for Saoirse or letter M for Matt against your questions, so I can know, whom you're addressing your question to. I'd appreciate that very much. Other than that, make sure to take advantage of the like button via which you can vote for questions that you like, and I will make sure to prioritize these in the Q&A. Now, you're probably very much accustomed to events such as these, but please note that this session is being recorded so that we can share it on our website for all those people who couldn't join us. I'm so pleased to be able to say that our speakers on this occasion are the Open University's own Matthew Jones and Saoirse O'Shea, both of whom are successfully acquiring and querying organisational practice for quite some time now, and no less but in some of the most traditionally masculine, often compellingly heteronormative environments, even if they're not so in reality underneath the surface. This evening, I'm, of course, I should say that I'm talking here of settings such as police and prisons everywhere. Yet this evening, thanks to Matt's and Saoirse's unique access and cutting edge research, we will gain a glimpse into these settings in the context of England and Wales. So Matt will share his findings about the cultural shift that took place in the police that enabled those who have once been deemed the biggest threat to the integrity of the police service, lesbian, gay and bisexual people, to be actively recruited into the policing ranks. Saoirse, on the other hand, will share their findings about the experiences of non-binary and trans people in prisons, looking into how their sexual and romantic relationships bear on their lives in such settings. The research of both cuts deep into the flesh of conservative attitudes, hate crimes, and other hateful behaviors directed at the LGBT plus community. And we are very proud that such important research comes from the Open University and is presented to you through GOP. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Matt. Matt, over to you.
Great, thank you, Nella, and thank you for the invite to speak at this event today. So as my slide suggests, I'm going to be talking about some research that I conducted into the career experiences of lesbian, gay and bisexual police officers. Next slide, please. The reason why I decided to conduct this research was quite personal. So at the time I was considering a career in policing, and as a gay man, I started asking myself questions about how I would navigate my identity and whether there was actually a place for me within policing where I could make an authentic contribution. I started to look into some of the literature around gay men in policing, and I came across the work of Mark Burke, which at the time was the only study that had looked into homosexuality and policing, but had quite dramatic insights and emotive findings with a description of LGBT individuals representing a contamination and a threat to the integrity of British policing at the time. And the reason for that was fourfold. The first was around the gendered and heteronormative nature of policing. And so the work on police culture and machismo as an ingredient to being a successful police officer is well documented and was presented as an exclusionary ingredient to why LGBT individuals might be deterred from policing. There was rife discrimination in recruitment, but also when you join the police, then in terms of deployment, so the type of work, police work that you get sent to, and the promotion process with bars to climb in the ladder and the ranks within policing for that group of officers. The justification amongst the dominant rank and file at the time seemed to be that they were representing the social climate and attitudes towards homosexuality at the time. There was a strong stock of officers who had experienced policing of homosexuality as illegal, and they described the hurdles of trying to psychologically manage that conceptualization as homosexually as deviant to then being somebody who was in their ranks and a legitimate colleague. So as a result of these quite dramatic hurdles, the majority of those who entered policing in Burke's time decided to disguise their sexuality and live what Burke described as the dual persona. So they would perform heterosexuality at work, but then when they left work, they would resort to their LGBT life. And that was psychologically burdensome, led to kind of high levels of absence and sickness at work, the inability to build legitimate and meaningful workplace friendships, which was quite a challenge given the stresses of police work. Next slide, please. But as I was reading this literature, as I said, the reasons why I wanted to look into this was because it's quite personal to me. As I was reading the literature, I felt like it wasn't really a representation of society and what I had heard policing was like some 15, 20 years after Mark Burke. And there were some reasons for that. So there had been legislation introduced which protected LGBT individuals within the workplace, and so I was left feeling, well, how is this happening? And surely now this any type of discrimination would result in people being fired or removed from the service. As a gay man, I felt that I was protected within society. There were legislation introduced for me to get married, to adopt children, and I felt that surely that this is translated into policing, where the underlying philosophy of policing is always the police are the public and the public are the police, signifying that the police are a representation of the social fabric at the time. Well, I was part of this new social fabric that was embracing of LGBT individuals, and surely there was a place for me in policing. But there was a big question mark there. I wasn't sure, and so I decided to do some research into it. And at the time, I was starting to see that the police were actively recruiting LGBT individuals into the police. It was kind of post-Macpherson policing, where diversity seemed to be the solution to some of the problems that the police have in terms of the machismo, the over-policing of minority communities. The police were advertising in the gay press, and there were big advertisements saying, you know, come and join us, policing is different now. And so I wanted to put that empirically to the test, and that's what I did. Next slide, please. And so just to give you a little bit of an overview, so my research was a mixed method design. So I initially launched a national survey. So there are 43 police forces in England and Wales, and that makes it hugely complex in terms of any research topic on policing. But I decided to cast the net wide and to see what would come back. And I was quite surprised that there were 838 officers who responded to the survey. And through that, I recruited then 43 officers to be interviewed. There were some very it wasn't easy to get people at the time to talk and to participate in my research, and my identity played quite a persuasive factor, and my own motivation to join the police and to to give a contemporary insight into homosexuality in the police. At the time, I had to, put myself out there and give legitimize myself as an authentic person, as somebody from that community who was interested in learning more. And next slide, please. And so the overarching finding of the research was kind of policing at the time when I was conducting the research was very different to the picture painted by Mark Burke in the late 1990s. So the survey found that 75% felt that the police currently does enough to support LGB officers. The majority were satisfied or very satisfied with being a police officer. 80% considered themselves to be out at work, contrasting this with Mark Burke, where there was only a handful of people who had decided to come out at work because of the professional and personal consequences that they faced. And so in this presentation, I want to focus in on some of the reasons that I uncovered as to why there had been this radical shift. Next slide, please. The first, which I'm going to touch on very briefly, was due to the recognition of homosexuality and the identities of LGBT individuals in the workplace. So at the time, kind of the Equality Act was coming into place. The College of Policing had been established, which established a code of conduct for police officers, and discrimination towards anyone within the police was seen as a dismissible offence, and the college were active in pursuing that. And there was also a senior officer commitment to enforcing this new code of conduct, and some very kind of public cases of senior officers pursuing dismissal for those officers who resorted to these pre-Macpherson policing behaviours of machismo and discrimination. But the two other and probably main aspects of that underpin change, and I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. And so the first is around power by number. So during Mark Burke's research, there were only a handful of individuals who were willing to talk to Mark as part of that research. He suggested that there was a very limited number of officers who considered themselves lesbian, gay, or bisexual at the time. And as a result, there was a lack of network, there was a lack of collegiate support, there were a lack of avenues for those with different identities to share some of the hurdles that they face, and to discuss those with similar colleagues who see policing through a similar lens. However, in my research, there had been that active recruitment of minority officers post Macpherson, and not just gay officers, but kind of from all different minority communities, as policing put a focus on increasing diversity across the board within their ranks. And as a result, kind of officers in my research recorded how they would, within their police stations and within their professional environment, they weren't the only one who was in policing. They often knew people either within their teams or within their stations, which again was very rare within Burke's research at the time. The Gay Police Association had been established, and that had evolved to more local groups, and that provided a social sense of community amongst officers as well, and it was a good mechanism for answering questions and facilitating the open and transparent disclosure of identity within professional settings, which historically had been not possible. But the most interesting thing for me, and which is why I've included this picture on here, is that my participants talked about how, because of their collective stock and the increased representation, they were able to challenge the dominant iconography of policing. So whereas policing was just about white men in black and white uniforms, they actively challenged that. So they introduced the lapels with the LGBT flag on. They had cars funded with the flags on, which they paraded throughout the community and at gay pride events. They had introduced things like gay flag laces that they would wear when they were on patrol. And it was all about starting a conversation and their colleagues saying, oh, why are you wearing that? And, you know, what's the background to that? Which helped them develop this legitimate identity within the workplace. Next slide, please. The other contributing factor was the creation of legitimate space for LGBT officers to make a contribution to contemporary policing. And so in a previous slide, I slightly overlooked the work of Leslie Moran that I introduced, and kind of he conceptually talked about the change from LGBT identities being deviant and being bad within society to being good and being individuals who should be protected by the police as one of our core social institutions. And through this, and through the introduction of hate crime legislation and equalities legislation and so on, there was a space for officers to make a contribution, so to build up relationships with those communities, so between the LGBT community and the police themselves. So these LGBT officers within the policing ranks were a mechanism to try and to rebuild these damaged historical relationships between the two parties, and to try and encourage those within society who were reluctant to report their victimization because of that historical antagonism and treatment, to actually come forward and to trust the police that they would pursue any complaints or reports of victimization. And so officers and my participants talked about how their identity is actually part of the contemporary policing toolkit. They gave some examples of that. So around specialist knowledge that they have from being a member of the LGBT community through different social and sexual practices to different technological trends and community engagement, and how this was useful in the investigation of hate crime and offences targeted against the LGBT community. They were really effective in building up stakeholder relationships, so being able to go to LGBT venues and saying, I'm an LGBT officer and I want to make a difference. I want to change things. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about crime prevention, and let's talk about how we can make people safe in your venues. And so again, their identity was were really useful there. But the title of my my presentation kind of about not just being a gay officer or an LGBT officer was really important to my participants as well. And so that, yes, they made a contribution to this new area of police work when it came to the policing of LGBT communities, but they were also keen to say that they make an enhanced contribution to traditional police work. And they felt that they, as LGBT individuals, were less forceful and confrontational, and therefore they pose less of a professional risk to the police organisations that employed them. They interestingly talked about policing being the investigation being a core skill, and trying to uncover truths where people were trying to hide things. And they felt that their experience of disclosing their identity and trying to pass themselves as heterosexual at some point in their lives actually gave them insight into some of the cues and the psychological tricks that people play to try and throw people off the scent. But ultimately, and the final point that I make is that they felt that they weren't just isolated officers themselves that were just there to deal with LGBT police work, but within a contemporary policing sense, the most effective police work is done in a patchwork way. So they're police teams that have different officers with different skills are most effective. So they talked about you do need that machismo cop who can chase someone over a wall and sit on them until a police van comes along. But you also need someone in the same team that at a different job can talk to a victim, can disclose their experiences and show empathy because they've been a victim of hate crime. And that's where kind of their key strengths as part of their patchwork are. My final slide, I'm mindful of time, so my final thoughts are, although my presentation today is about this cultural shift in policing, the story isn't over, and there are still areas where improvements are needed. But also I'm keen to stress the complexity of policing and not talking in quite a monolithic way about the experiences of all LGB officers in all aspects of policing. And so there are gender differences within the sample that I engage with, geographical differences. As I said, there are 43 different police forces, all that police different types of community and geography and have different challenges. And because identity is so located within the socio-cultural context in which people are located, it's, you need to acknowledge those differences and how those different contexts can shape the experiences of officers. Rank is another important factor, and so within my research, there were some senior officers who were willing to participate in my study but didn't want to be disclosed as LGB in my findings or when I was talking at public events, and that's because they felt a level of guilt with that, but they felt that they had to do that in order to climb to the senior ranks, and because it takes about 20 to 25 years to get to the upper echelons of the policing ranks. They were in policing when being homosexual was kind of within the Mark Burke era. So that they kind of felt, well, I'm part of it, I committed to it. Now I have to see it through until I finish my career. And then finally, there are different types of police work. So there are many popular police programs on TV at the minute. I won't mention the obvious one, but there are uniformed and ununiformed police. There are undercover police. There are armed police. These are all different, again, socio-cultural contexts in which an individual situates their identity. And a lot of my participants talked about the churn of police work. So they often don't join policing and just stay in that area. Every 2 or 3 years they change and working in a different area of policing, and so every time they have to think about, how am I going to manage my LGBT identity in this new context? Am I going to have to come out at work again? Are there people, if I decide not to, will I be discredited from a previous area that I worked in a few years ago where I did come out? And so these are the types of identity complexity that these officers are dealing with. I think I managed to keep to time. Hopefully I did, but thank you for listening.
Punctual as always. Thank you, Matt. This has been lovely to listen to. I believe that Saoirse has a question for you.
Hiya, Matt. Just a little bit of preamble into my question. I live up in Newcastle, and for many years Newcastle had what was seen as being quite an innovative LGBT outreach part of the police force here. And I've done some outreach work with them. What really surprised me when I was doing the outreach was that the police sergeant who I was doing it with, and this was late at night in the Pink Triangle, she was doing it voluntarily, unpaid. And it was as if the police wanted to be seen to be LGBT friendly, but were not willing, certainly at that point, to actually pay her and fully recognise her for doing it as part of her job. And I think my question is, have the police nationally moved on to see it as being part of their integrated into their role as a police force?
Thanks, Saoirse. That's a really interesting question. And of course, I was based in Newcastle for some time as well. So I have some personal experience, similar personal experience, and some experience of engaging with those LGBT staff groups. Unfortunately, so I actually conducted a project with Northumbria Police about police responses to LGBT hate crime. And one of the things that I found was that the LGBT liaison officers weren't being used effectively. There wasn't a central kind of resource as to who they were. There was underinvestment and actually a retreat in investment to paying officers for working on dedicated projects. And often the case it's that you are a generic officer first, and then if you have the time, then you can offer to be part of these specialist projects. And I don't feel that nationally that is any better. And potentially one of the a challenge for the police is how do you differentiate between those who are LGBT in policing and those and the skills they bring, compared to there is a dedicated role of being an LGBT liaison officer, and you don't have to be LGBT to be an LGBT liaison officer, and there seems to be a disconnect between that about how to tap into the innate skills of those who join policing who happen to be LGBT, compared to those who are willing to put themselves forward to engage in those roles. So it's something that I've talked about with the police several times about kind of developing a system that draws upon and utilizes identity in more of a strategic way, because ultimately it's benefiting victims. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to build up those relationships. You're trying to overcome those historical resistances and the reluctance that even young LGBT individuals express as to why they aren't reporting when they're victims of hate crime. And so I think there's a big role to play with the police there in terms of how they manage that internal resource based on the policy rationale as to why they're recruiting officers from diverse communities.
Thank you, Matt. I think before we go into the conventional Q&A, we will go first to Saoirse and their presentation, and to hear a bit more about the other side of, the equation, the experiences of people in prison. Saoirse, over to you.
Thank you, Nella. I'm Saoirse. My presentation is based loosely around a nearly 3-year research project that I've been involved in with other people who are based at the University of Leicester. And it's a qualitative study where we're interested in understanding the lived experiences of trans and non-binary prisoners in the English and Welsh estate. It's also a study which we believe is actually quite innovative in the country, because it's the only one that's nationwide, and that is qualitative, that is directed from the viewpoint of the actual participants themselves. I'm going to say from the outset, I'm going to take a political position. I'm going to do it because, as Edward Said has said, we need to be politicised as academics. We cannot be neutral we have to take a stance when we believe that there is an injustice in the world, and we need to call it out. The position is mine. I'm not saying it's the position of the research group I am part of. Next slide, please. This is the media image that is often portrayed of trans prisoners in the English and Welsh estate. This is taken from the webpage of Fair Play for Women. And I'm going to be political. I'm going to call them a transphobic hate group. I'm sure they won't like that description, but it's the way I see them. Their narrative is one, and I'm going to use Elizabeth Bernstein's conception. Their narrative is one of carceral feminism. It's where they are trying to ratchet up the punishment that a certain marginalised group in society receive. And that marginalised group are trans people. And the way they're doing it is that they want to present the idea, and this is played out in national media and has been done for several years, they want to play out the idea that trans people, not just trans prisoners, but trans people generally, are paedophiles and sex offenders. Now, this person is Karen White. You might all recognise Karen White. She was someone who was actually moved into the female estate in the UK because of her prison not actually carrying out their duty of care properly. But Karen has been used as a weapon to argue that all trans prisoners should be kept in the male estate, and they should be kept there because, according to the national media, according to groups like Fair Play for Women and so on, all trans people, all trans prisoners are sexual deviants and potential sex offenders and are therefore a risk to women prisoners. Next slide, please. Just some ideas about what it's actually like for trans prisoners. These actually come as quotes about one that positions the media narrative, but also that positions that media narrative and how it influences government policy. HMPPS 2016 was the previous prison rules and regulations about how trans prisoners were governed in the criminal estate in the United Kingdom. After Karen White, it was changed. And we went from HMPPS, which was seen as being one of the most progressive prison regulations for trans people, one of the most regressive regulation and rulings in Western Europe. Next slide, please. And I should say that's largely been done, I would say, because of the transphobic narrative about Karen White in the national media. Prisons generally are violent places. The male estate is particularly seen as being violent and volatile. The vast majority of trans prisoners are held in the male estate. Something like about 25 trans prisoners who identify and are trans women are held in the female estate. Next slide, please. The vast majority are held in the male estate. At the present moment in time, there is on average 1,000 assaults, sexual and physical assaults on women in the female estate per year. The female population varies between 4,500 to 5,000 prisoners, 1,000 physical or sexual assaults, 20-odd trans women prisoners. The media narrative focuses on the trans prisoners to give the impression that they are responsible for sexual violence in the female estate. The figures don't add up. And you just let that sink in for a minute. And whilst it does, the majority of prisoners, trans prisoners, are in the male estate. The prisoners in the male estate are 20 times more likely to be the victim of a violent sexual or physical assault than a woman in the female estate. What we don't see is the national media talking about that. There's silence on it. They don't want to discuss that. They want to play out a narrative that trans people are violent sexual predators. It's carceral feminism. Let's target a minority group and attack them. Next slide, please. A long time ago, back in the 1950s, a criminologist called Saoirse talked about the 5 pains of imprisonment. We normally think that the removal of liberty is the pain of imprisonment. We take from prisoners their liberty. That is supposed to be the punishment that they receive when they are in prison. Saoirse identified 4 others, of which sex is one of those 5. If you're in prison, you are limited and you are not supposed to be able to have sex. It's against the official rules. It's not condoned. Prison authorities tend to turn a blind eye to the idea that sex actually happens in prison. It's a fact of daily life. Lock people up, adults up, in a big room, away together, and lo and behold, sex will happen. But we pretend it doesn't. Prison authorities have a tendency to turn a blind eye to it unless it's reported to them, and then they have to act. And normally the way they act is to separate the 2 people involved. Next slide, please. And usually, sex when it occurs in prison, usually the narrative is that it's coercive sex. But it's rape. But it's also played out that sex occurs in the male estate as gay for stay. The male estate is positioned as being heterosexual by and large, and that anyone who has sex in prison in the male estate is only gay for stay, and that when they come out, they'll carry on being heterosexual. So one of our correspondents, P27, said to us, it's actually really quite surprising how many people approached them looking for sex whilst in prison. whilst still maintaining that they were straight. Sex happens. It happens in prison. And yet there is this heteronormative belief that it's gay for stay. And it feeds into a homosocialization, where we end up with the idea of an alpha male heteronormative society within prison, and it ignores the idea that you actually have other male masculine communities within prison, which includes LGBT people. Next slide, please. What it also tends to feed is the narrative that sex in prison is wrong, that sex in prison is violent, that it's coercive, that people only have sex in prison if they're being coerced, or sometimes if they're doing it either to try and get protection or access to drugs or other illicit contraband. People don't have sex in prison because they want to. They want to do it either because they're forced into it or because they're doing it to get access to something else. But it's not the case. But actually, again, lacks granularity. Yes, that does occur. And we can find that sort of sex where there is some degree of coercion in the narratives from people like Val Janus, who looked at California state penitentiaries and reported on coercive sex in prison and how trans people very often use sex for protection. They have sex with individuals to protect themselves, to be forced into sex with other prisoners. The idea is if you have sex with one big alpha male, the alpha male will protect you from being forced into sex with multiple people. And that does go on. But what I also want to bring out is it's not the only story. Most of our correspondents also tell us that they have romantic relationships inside prison. They build a relationship with other people who are attracted to them, which again contradicts the gay for stay narrative. People in prison can build healthy relationships between themselves, and that sometimes sex happens in a romantic relationship. Slightly watching my time here. Two of our prisoners, both Sharon and P27 again, have talked about how they've built long-term relationships. Sharon is talking about how her long-term relationship there will actually carry on outside of prison, that she actually believes that when she leaves prison, that her partner, whom she got engaged to in prison, and her will get married outside prison. It's not just gay for stay. People are actually trying to build lifelong committed relationships. Sex in prison is not all about violence. Next slide, please. But sex doesn't always happen. A lot of trans people are on the receiving end of violent relationships. A lot of our correspondents tell us life histories where prior to being incarcerated, they were on the receiving end of violent sexual abuse. As Hotaru makes clear here, from her previous history and her history inside prison, she doesn't want to have a sexual relationship. She's actually put off having a sexual relationship or a romantic relationship with any male ever again. And these are the people whom the carceral feminists in transphobic media play out as being violent sexual predators. People who are trying to build a life for themselves, people who've been so violated, who are the victims of sexual abuse in many instances, who are played out as being the perpetrators and the ones who are at fault. Next slide, please. That's the Home Office rule. We're not supposed to talk about sex in prison. Prisoners are not supposed to have sex in prison. If they do have sex in prison, they run the risk of being sanctioned, even if they're having a romantic liaison with their partner, even if they're trying to build a productive relationship. They can be punished and separated, sent to separate wings, sent to separate prisons. Next slide, please. And so I just really want to ask a question. Why? What are we trying to achieve? Isn't prison supposed to be about rehabilitation? Aren't we supposed to be trying to help prisoners to reform, to build productive, useful lives? So why do we ban them from having sex in prison? Why do we see having romantic relationships as non-productive? Why do we have to separate them? Why do we castigate prisoners beyond the removal of their liberty? Why carceral feminism? Thank you. That's the end.
Thank you very much, Saoirse. May I just ask you to mute your mic, please, Saoirse, temporarily. I feel very privileged listening to both of your research, because I have never had such an insight. I have never been privy to these kind of experiences and insights, especially in the context of England and Wales. We had some amazing questions in Q&A, and I would like to start with the DIP book question for both of you. How gender identity, whether you have any kind of insight into how gender identity intersected with race and ethnicity in your research. First, perhaps Matt, and then Saoirse.
Thank you, great question. So I did have some participants whose identities fell into to multiple strands, and they saw it as another level of complexity in terms of juggling that professional identity. And so, of course, there's a huge literature on the cultural struggles of Black officers in policing, which directly relates to the policing of Black communities and the Brixton riots and the Macpherson report. And so there was a real heightened identity struggle for my participants who were lesbian, gay, or bisexual, but also an ethnic minority as well. And so that was certainly the case.
Our research hasn't actually looked at intersectionality in quite that direction. The work of Valerie Jenis has, and has discussed quite clearly how, certainly in the American prison estate, where trans prisoners are very often an ethnic minority, that the pains of imprisonment that they face are very often also deeply intersected with racial violence.
Thanks both. A very good question from Elaine for Matt. Matt, do you see this proportionality in respect of the career journey, that some officers still feel the need to conform to traditional kind of binary gender roles in order to avoid LGBTQ plus sticky flaws?
So sorry, is the question about whether that still exists?
Yes. Have you noticed that in your research?
So I think it's less prevalent, but it certainly still exists. And again, is shaped by the biography and the experiences of the individual within policing, but also prior to them joining policing. So within the research, one of the things that I developed is an identity map. And how that's shaped at different temporal points throughout the policing career, and actually an individual's negotiation of their identity starts several years before they join policing, and that was my experience as well around, you know, how have I lived as an LGBT individual within society, and then thinking about profession and where I fit, and you know, how am I going? Is this going to be a strategic performance of identity? Do I not come out initially, but then decide to come out once I know kind of how the land lies and how people and whether people are going to accept me? And I still think, although maybe not as concentrated, that still exists for individuals in the LGBT community as well today.
Yeah, that's interesting how some of these norms persist despite of all these initiatives and despite of the efforts that these police officers are doing in their workplaces. Excellent question from Joe for Saoirse. Saoirse, is there any data from your project indicating that certain sorts of sex are more likely to attract censure from the staff and other prisoners?
It's really quite hard to identify specifically. One would think that prison staff, the major censure would be violent, coercive sex, particularly rape in the male estate. Yet we have correspondents who have told us that they have been subjected to violent sexual assault, which prison staff have turned a blind eye to. We also know that others have also told us that they have been in a romantic liaison and prison staff have had to separate them because of other prisoners complaining. There is a narrative within prisons that some prisoners will deliberately complain about the behaviour of other prisoners just to get the other prisoners into trouble. It's a form of sort of like bullying and vendetta. And the difficulty is if someone makes an official complaint, it has to be acted on. But prison staff can and do turn a blind eye to some situations which really they should act on, but don't.
Thanks, Saoirse. For Matt, similar question to Elaine's from Cinzia. Have you noticed that there is now a hierarchy of LGBTQ groups according to which LGBT individuals are more included because they conform to more normative behaviors? So basically those copying heteronormative behaviors within LGBT groups who get married, adopt children, you know, follow all these kind of typically heteronormative practices. Have you noticed this occurring in your data set, Matt?
Yeah, that was certainly the case. And so those, especially for gay men who have effeminate traits or who are considered to be camp, they are often still experience that resistance and discrediting. And there were some participants who talked about a sense of pride that they hadn't been guessed to be LGBT by their colleagues, because they're just a normal person who happens to be gay. Whereas there are different spectrums of identity within the LGBT communities, and some are more visible than others, and those that are more visible tend to still have some resistance. But still, there's an opportunity because of the openness of sexuality in the workplace now to overcome some of those hurdles. So legitimacy of identity was a dominant theme, and the ability to put a picture on your desk of your husband or your wife or your children, and for your partner to make a gesture when you're at work, and for you to talk about your personal life at work, was a way of building legitimate friendships rather than identity being about stereotypes. So to show that there's a person behind the campness, behind the uniform, behind the machismo. Even when people act in a machismo way, there's often a reason why they're performing that. And so trying to understand colleagues and why they act and perform different identities.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you, Matt. Saoirse, you mentioned prior to this talk that some Ministry of Justice data shows that trans women are 20 times more likely to be the victims of violent sexual assault in prison than cis women prisoners of any sexual assault whatsoever. So are there, considering the availability of such data, are there measures put in place to protect specifically trans and non-binary people in prisons in England and Wales?
Trans prisoners are covered by the various PSIs, the prison instructions. Or rather, they used to be called prison instructions. It's now called a framework. The framework largely sets out how trans prisoners can be treated by the prison authorities. What they don't really do an awful lot of is talk about how trans prisoners can be protected within the estate from violent assault, because violent assault is not supposed to happen. So there's not really anything specific. It's just the generalized idea that prisoners are supposed to be protected from violent assault, even though it occurs pretty routinely within the estate. What does happen, and happens far too often, is trans prisoners are seen as being vulnerable, and so they are locked up in solitary confinement. And so essentially the trans prisoner becomes punished for being the victim of violent sexual assaults and violent physical attacks. They get locked up, solitary confinement. And then they wonder why it is that trans prisoners don't want to come out and announce themselves to the prison authorities that they are trans.
Yeah, it's a huge surprise, isn't it? Matt, I have one question for you, and then I will ask you to ask your own question to Saoirse from the perspective of your research. I found the BBC survey into 45 police forces in the UK, which reveals that the number of reported homophobic hate crime cases almost trebled since same-sex partnerships have been legalized in 2014, 2015. So I think that the initial number in 2014 was something around 7,000 reported cases, and now, for the year 2019-2020, that number increased to nearly 19,000. So, how do you interpret these findings from the standpoint of your research, and considering all the things that you have told us about how practice has changed? Are such crimes now more reported, or is there indeed an increase in homophobic behaviour? What do you think?
I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. I think my personal experience and my reading of the literature is that we're always going to have homophobia and transphobia in society, and it's quite utopian to think that it'll never exist. But I think a more persuasive factor is the fact that the police have invested in building relationships with the LGBT community through, from what I've been talking about, the increased recruitment of officers from those communities in an attempt to damage historical harms and to build trust. And as a result, we're seeing the impact of that, where rather than thinking of the police as or as an organisation that will harm them, now a big proportion of the LGBT community think they're there to protect them, and that's a complex statement, because it is still there are still those historical harms, and there are still those who are very resistant to engaging with the police. But I think on the whole, the picture is improving, and that translates into higher levels of reporting.
Thank you, Matt. You said you have a question for Saoirse about her own research.
Yes. Thank you, Saoirse, for your presentation. I really enjoyed that. It was political and it was thought-provoking, and I have lots of questions that I've written down. But one that I'd like to ask is, so my identity as a gay man was very important to my research in terms of the motivation, the negotiation of access, the lens through which I interpreted my findings. I was wondering how your identity shaped your research that you've talked about.
Well, I'm non-binary, metagender, and it does have an influence, both that I wanted to do this research, and also, to use the cliched term, it gives me insider knowledge of some of the themes that might come out and might possibly be there in the research. What I would say is that we haven't actually done grounded theory, but to a large extent, we've tried to allow the themes to come out of the research rather than direct it from any presuppositions that we had. Well, like I say, I hesitate to call it grounded. What it does, though, is give me and the research teams some idea of what the participants are talking about. I mean, to use something that's not an example of sex, when they're actually talking about the medicalisation of their treatment. I've been through the entire medical process. I know what the effects of hormones are on me, and I know how difficult it is to access that. And so when they start talking about that, I have some understanding of what they're talking about. But I don't use my experience to direct what they want to talk about. We allowed them to talk about it, and then it helped. My experience helps inform how we understand it, and we then go back and test our understanding with them again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Saoirse. unfortunately, this is all the time we have left in this session, and I can see that more and more questions are coming in, especially from Julia, George, Cynthia, Vicky, Leila. Thank you for all those thought-provoking questions, and thank you, Matt and Saoirse, for this wonderful presentation. To those whose questions Matt and Saoirse did not get to answer here, they will make sure to consider them in the following days, and they will make sure to send you their responses. So thank you for posting them here. And finally, please stay tuned for all upcoming GOP events and those from our Academic Centre of Excellence, brief on the Business School Twitter account, and we hope to see you all soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.